Hello everyone. Today I want to show a game played in the World Championship match of 2012 between Viswanathan Anand and Boris Gelfand. Let's check it out. It starts with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, f3, and c5. So it's a Benoni-like structure. Bishop g7 and then c5 could also have been an option, but this move order ensures a Benoni-like structure right from the third move itself. D5, just claiming a little more space, avoiding some central changes, and D6, very typical of the Benoni, and now E4. Bishop G7, and knight to E2. Knight C3 was another developing move, but Anand had something different in mind. Black castles, and it's an interesting idea here that there is a question of how to develop the e2 knight, and Anand played knight e to c3, and he'll find a different square for the b1 knight. This it has been played before. It's not a novelty, but yeah, knight h5 was played here. Now it seems a bit odd. Why do we play the same piece twice? E6 was a very reasonable continuation. So let's say if we say E6, then something like Bishop G5 is possible. Bishop E3 is also possible because Knight G4 can't harass the bishop. F3 has already been played. Bishop E3 is possible. Bishop G5 is a line which will provoke H6 first, and then you go back to Bishop E3. Maybe black trades in the center once, E takes d5, C takes d5. So very, you can say it reminds us of the Benoni more so than the King's Indian. But knight h5 is played, and here perhaps you are tempting and baiting white to play g4, which would be a very committal move right in the opening. White's king is in the center, black has castled, white has to develop the light square bishop. And if white has to go castle queenside, then a lot of pieces have to be developed for that to happen. So g4 would be too committal right from the beginning. Maybe if g4 immediately, then you can play e6 or maybe even e5, and then queen h4 ideas are possible later on. After, of course, the knight moves, but it's possible. But Anand chose a more reasonable move in bishop to g5 afterwards, just uh, developing a piece, preventing an immediate e6. No need to rush essentially with g4. That's the point. And bishop to f6, an interesting idea by Gelfand. Now, typically we say that if we have fianchettoed a bishop, especially, and we have castle on the same side, we want to preserve that bishop, just so that there are no weaknesses in the dark squares or light squares for white, as the case may be. But here, Gelfand offers his bishop up for exchange. Another reasonable alternative could have been, let's say, h6 and bishop e3, f5 afterwards, just striking in the center because white has not castled. Let's remember that. And after e takes and g takes, you have, let's say, queen d2 and then f4. There is counterplay. So bishop tucks back, you develop a piece, maybe probably knight d7. That's a reasonable alternative, but bishop f6 was played. Now Anand captured the bishop, although bishop e3 also deserves some consideration here. We can see that both the pieces, the minor pieces on the king side for black, are a bit misplaced. Knight is on the rim, it's not doing anything on h5 now. Bishop on f6 is occupying the square the knight wants to occupy. So perhaps now the threat of g4 is a bit stronger, because now even if the e pawn were to move for black, the queen is not coming to h4. One more thing to note. Anyway, Anand captured, and Gelfand captured with the e pawn. He didn't retreat with the knight. I think the idea here is to push f5 here, although perhaps capturing with the knight, knight f6, and then later on, let's say queen d2 to develop an e5. This was also quite reasonable. It offers counterplay on both sides. The position is fine for black, but I suspect that Gelfand wanted to push f5 and use the e pawn as an extra f pawn and undermine the center. That was probably the idea. Queen d2, reasonable, safe developing move. You could, of course, a lot of moves are possible. G4 again was an idea, but again it's quite committal. Anand holds off on that. And f5. That was the point. E takes f5, and now the bishop is developed with tempo, grabbing a pawn. And now at first glance it seems that you can fork two pieces with g4, which is the move Anand played. But bishop into b1 is an option. There are a couple of lines here. There could be, let's say, a couple of moves here. You can capture the knight on b1 immediately. You could throw in, let's say, a queen h4 check, maybe king d1 here, or perhaps queen h4 and king f2, rook e8, and then bishop e2. This could be a little uncomfortable, so perhaps king d1 and then bishop into b1 is an option. It would transpose probably, but yes. So let's say if you were to do bishop into b1 and rook into b1, then queen h4, that can also be possible. However, Gelfand made a small inaccuracy. He played rook e8 check instead of queen h4 check, or grabbing the knight. This just allows Anand to hide away on d1, which is fairly safe. The central pawn structures of white are quite solid, and the d1 square is fairly safe for white. Because if bishop e2 here, then queen h4, and then king d1, not the best, playable, but it's not needed to waste a move to develop the bishop passively on e2. When rook e8 is played, might as well just tuck away the king on d1. So king d1 was played. Now bishop into b1 and rook into b1. And here Gelfand went wrong. He underestimated, he miscalculated essentially. Knight f6 or knight g7, both are reasonable alternatives, and both will actually allow h4 idea, h4, h5 idea, and a pawn stormed on the king side. But that's okay. White is slightly better, but it's not over at all. Black certainly has its chances. But Gelfand thought that queen f6 threatening a queen into f3, which would fork the king and the rook, would be enough compensation for the knight. But that's not enough. Anand captured. He calculated it perfectly well. And after queen into f3 check and king goes to c2, we have queen into h1. He grabbed the rook. This is the error. Now perhaps you can spot the move Anand played. How do you take advantage of black's miscalculation? Maybe you can pause the video here. The move is queen f2, and we see that the black queen has no squares left to go. It can't get out. It only had the f3 square available to escape, but now that's no longer there. And there's a threat that the bishop moves, and then you have to give up the queen for the rook. So two rooks compared to a queen and a knight, it's a good deal for white. So that would be losing. So the only way to avoid losing the queen would be to play knight to c6. In fact, let me clarify now. At this position, Gelfand resigned. He resigned because he has to play knight to c6 and give up that knight, which has no choice. So after d into c6, queen into c6, and bishop g2. And white's pieces are much better. The h5 pawn will be used to soften the black king's defenses. The d5 square is available for the bishop and for the knight. The rook on b1 can come on f1, so let's say queen c8 here, then rook f1, forcing probably rook f8, then maybe you can land a bishop on d5, you can land a knight on d5, threatening knight f6. A lot is possible. Or perhaps rook f1, queen f6, and then threatening h6 is also an idea. So there are many possibilities here. That's why after queen f2, Gelfand resigned, and it shows us that even at the highest levels, even in the World Championship, some small oversights, you miss one move, and it can cost you the game, and you go for a wrong line. Of course, there are many examples of that. This is just one of them. Well, thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.